Hi guys, welcome back. In the previous video, we discussed how the elasticity of demand varies along a linear downward sloping demand curve. And in this video, we're going to be discussing the relation between elasticity and marginal revenue. Now you can see that I have a downward sloping average revenue demand curve and a marginal revenue curve as well. And it's showing the different regions of elasticity along the same average revenue demand curve, right? Where in this region, we have an elastic demand and then we have a unitary elastic demand in the center of the average revenue demand curve, while in this region we are seeing that the demand is inelastic. So technically what's happening is that elasticity falls as we go down the demand curve, right? Now guys, you need to establish some important relations about how, what impact does elasticity along a demand curve will have on the marginal revenue, right? So guys, when PED is elastic, right? So in the region where PED is elastic, in this region, so whenever the firm is, whenever the firm is selling a quantity in this region, so whenever the quantity demanded and the amount it is selling is within this region, because each time it needs to sell more, it needs to reduce the price, right, to increase quantity demanded. So, and in that region, we know that it's elastic. So basically what's going to happen is that in the region where PD is greater than 1, you see that your total revenue will be rising, right? So in this region where our demand curve is elastic, we can also see the relation that our total revenue is actually rising, right? We witness that our total revenue is rising, although it's rising at a reducing rate, but still it's rising, right? So we witness that our total revenue curve is actually going up, right? And at the same time, we also see that our total revenue is going up, but then also see that our marginal revenue, although it's going down, but it's still positive. So we have established a good relation here that whenever the demand is greater than 1, PD is greater than 1, basically the marginal revenue will always be positive, right? So the marginal revenue will be positive in the region where your PD is greater than 1 and you are selling, and as you sell more quantity, your marginal revenue is positive, right? In the region where your PD is elastic and its total revenue is rising, and obviously at a decreasing rate. So we know that demand is always elastic in the center of the demand curve, the center of the average revenue curve, right? So whenever the PD is equals to 1, that is unitary elastic, your total revenue will be maximum. At the same time, you will see that your marginal revenue is 0. And you can see that as well. So I've taken the quantities that are the same that I used in the example where I explained in the video that relates to revenue and revenue in imperfect markets. So these are the same values. I've extracted a portion from there from the table that I had drawn over in that video. And as you can see that as the quantity goes up from 5 to 6, your price is, although your average price, your average revenue is going down, but then your total revenue remains the same. So if you calculate the elasticity for these changes in prices and the changes in quantity, you will witness that your PD, the value of your PD equals to 1, and your total revenue is exactly the same, right? And if your total revenue is the same at a quantity of 5 and at a quantity of 6, which means that there's no additional revenue that you gain by selling 6 units, let's say, the next day, so instead of 5 on the previous day, right? So which means that, and that is why we see that a total revenue curve is like this, right? It's sort of flat in this region, which is indicating that, let's say, if you were selling 5 units and then you were selling 6 units, so your total revenue is, let's say, $30. And if you calculate the slope between these 2 points, point A and B, right? If you calculate the slope on these points, that will exactly be, which is your marginal revenue, the slope of total revenue is marginal revenue, that will always actually be equal to 0. And that is why your marginal revenue is 0, right? And basically, if your marginal revenue is 0, which is indicating over a region, I mean, if your marginal revenue is 0, over a region where your total revenue is basically the same, that is constant, indicating there's no addition to marginal revenue. So basically what it means is that, we know from the rules of elasticity that total revenue does not changes. So if PD equals to 1, total revenue does not changes, and that is why we say that if you see so if MR is 0 and total revenue is maximum in this region, right? In this region, if total revenue is your maximum, then, in this region, basically, so basically, if we sort of try to extend this line upwards, if we take this point, that is where MR is, cutting the, horizontal quantity intercept. And if we take this point and we extend it to the average revenue curve, because we need to see the corresponding point, so we say that, this point is indicating that your PD equals to 1. But it's not actually a point where your PD is equals to 1. It's actually a range, because it's actually a range of quantity. Like you could say that maybe this range, right? So it's a small range, which is this range where your PD equals to 1. It's equals to unit. So basically that is why we say that your PD is actually equal to 1 at the center, right? But you don't need to sort of explain it in the exam that it's a range and it's a small range, or you can just extend it, you can extend your line up to the average revenue curve and say, at this point the PD equals to 1. But when we say in your economics textbooks, when it's written that in the at this point PD equals to 1, what they're trying to say is that the PD equals to 1 at the center in a certain quantity range, right? And after that, we see that your demand is inelastic. So when your PD is equals to 1, basically your total revenue is maximum and your marginal revenue is 0. That's it. And when your PD is inelastic, so whenever the PD is inelastic in a range of quantity, right, in this range the PD is inelastic, so we can establish the relationship that in this range when PD is inelastic, if you're selling more output, right, if the quantity demand is going up and you're selling more output, by reducing the price you can see that your total revenue is going down, right? And also what happens to MR, your MR is negative. So in this entire range of output where PD is inelastic, and in this entire range of output, basically your MR would be negative. And the reason why it would be negative is because your total revenue is going down. So definitely your MR is negative because it's pulling the total revenue down as well. So you're not earning anything. In fact, it's reducing your total revenue. Instead of adding to total revenue, your total revenue is going down. So there's negative revenue basically on each additional unit sold. You are decreasing your total revenues because you're earning a negative revenue there. And you can see from the same table that I've drawn, I've extracted from there, that if you reduce the price from 5 to 4, right, and the quantity goes up from 6 to 7, so your total revenue in fact goes down from 30 to 28, right? And that is why the marginal revenue you can see is -2. So in the range where your PD is basically inelastic, so for all the output that you produce, for all the output that you sell in that range, basically, not produce, because we're talking about quantity demanded here. For all the output that a monopolist in imperfect market sells in that range, your total revenue will be declining and your marginal revenue will be negative, basically. And guys, we also know that we also studied in AS as well, that if you reduce the price and the demand is elastic, right, the total revenue goes up, because although your price goes down basically, but then since quantity demanded rises significantly more, relatively more, comparatively more than price, so total revenue goes up. And since PD is unity elastic, so the quantity and the price, they change in the same proportion, so total revenue is the same. When PD is less than 1, if you reduce the price to increase quantity, right, so in that case what happens is that your total revenue, instead of going up, it actually goes down, because what happens is that in the range where your PD is inelastic, you're reducing the price, but then quantity demanded isn't sensitive to the price fall, so it doesn't really relative to the price fall, it rises insignificantly, and that brings your overall total revenues down. So guys, before I end this video, what we learn is that unlike the case of a price taking firm, the total revenue curve for a firm in imperfect market is not a straight line. It's actually a curve that rises at first and then it falls. But why? So the thing is that as long as your marginal revenue is positive and your demand is price elastic, so rise in output will raise total revenue. However, once your marginal revenue becomes negative and hence your average revenue is inelastic in that range, total revenue will fall, right? And the peak of the total revenue curve, where total revenue curve peaks basically, right, will be where your marginal revenue equals to 0, and at that point the price elasticity of demand would be equal to 1. So that's it guys for this video, and now we're going to be starting with profit maximization. I'll see you all in that video. Until then, take care.